Hello, Taras here. Welcome to another episode of our running series on Ocean State Aquatics Television, What is a Coral? Today we're going to be talking about another classic yet extremely confounding family, the Acroporidae. Before we were filming this episode, Ernie was joking with me and Eli saying, if it ends in pora, it's gonna die. Acropora, it's gonna die. And Acropora, it's gonna die. That's not to say people don't have success with this coral family. People certainly do, but it's after they kind of dedicate themselves to really getting to know the hobby, and it's usually kind of a trail of tears getting your way towards success with some of the members of this family. So the Acroporidae, what's so difficult about them? So the Acroporidae, or the staghorn corals, because certainly they don't all come in the staghorn shape. Some of them are completely different, like this Alveopora here doesn't look anything like a staghorn. Plating Monty doesn't look anything like a staghorn. But these are some of the majority of the reef-building photosynthetic corals in the world. They radiate from the Indo-Pacific region, radiating from the Great Barrier Reef, where they form these massive pelagic reef systems. Acro comes from the Greek meaning summit, which means that these corals like to climb to the top, on top of all the skeletons of all the corals dead and past, and they like to be at the top of that peak, absorbing all that sunlight, enjoying all that flow, and turning all the water chemistry around them and biomineralizing it into giant, fantastic architectural shapes made of calcite and aragonite. Which is why when many people think of corals, they think of something that looks like many members of the Acropora family. They all have corallite, with the exception of the Astreopora. They have little corallite at the end of their polyps, and they're always undergoing this beautiful expansion of their architecture. Like we talked about with the Poeciloporidae, these are corals that enjoy and require a state of dynamic stability. Stability in that they require stable levels of calcium, stable pH levels, stable alkalinity levels. They don't like swings, but at the same time, in order to achieve that stability, it's because they have a constant dynamic ocean around them that's fluxing, constantly taking organic wastes away and constantly replenishing the chemical supply of the primo ocean water that they need. So that's why they can be very difficult to early aquarists, because you're doing something very counterintuitive. You're trying to take a big wild ocean body filled with all this natural flushing and natural food supply, and you're trying to mimic it in a box. In the wild, these corals, because they live in the open environment through very clear water close to the surface, they go through these massive wild spawning events cued with the moon, where they have these massive hermaphroditic sperm and egg explosions, and that's usually how they settle throughout new areas, because for the most part they are fragile, and even though they can reproduce through fragging, these corals don't end up in the right opportune spot of flow, nutrients, and light. They have very little success of succeeding. So to talk about a little bit of the challenges when it comes to spreading and having success with this wonderful family, let's check in with Eli in the trenches.
Hey there, Eli again to give you a closer look at the Acroporidae family. As Taras was kind of saying, this family does cover a lot more diversity than we kind of give it credit for. Although it is named after the Acropora genus of corals in specific, it does also include Montiporas, like these few examples you see here, Astreopora, Acropora, and even Alveopora. So it is kind of a smorgasbord of all these different genera of corals, and it does cover a wide level of diversity. However, this does tend to be one of my favorite families of coral to look at. It does house a lot of this diversity that is just kind of intriguing to see how many different growth forms and how many different types and colors of corals that you can get from such a diverse group of corals. Generally, these, like Taras was saying, do require much more stable conditions, very stable salinity, temperature, alkalinity, calcium, and the supplementation of things like magnesium and trace elements are absolutely necessary for long-term success with most of these corals. They're definitely not the easiest coral to jump into for beginners. However, for the seasoned aquarist, most of these corals are going to be something that you're going to start adding to your tank. As with most of the Acroporas, most of the Montiporas, they do tend to appreciate a good level of light and a good level of flow. This generally applies to all of the branching varieties like this Montipora digitata and this Acropora you see in the back. They appreciate a good level of light, a good amount of flow, whereas maybe some of the other growth forms of, say, Montipora or in Acropora, some of these things that are a little more plating in shape might prefer a little less wave action, a little less light. However, they all do appreciate very stable water conditions. In terms of aquaculture, most of these species are very conducive to aquaculture. With branching varieties of, say, Acropora or Montipora, it's very easy to use a pair of bone cutters, cut some small segments of this coral up and super glue it to a frag plug. And as long as the same conditions are met for the smaller frag, generally you have a good success with growing them. With some of the other types of corals, maybe a bandsaw might be required, but in general they do take very well to fragging, so a lot of the varieties that you're going to see available are long-term captive strains, and it is actually very rare to find any of these from the wild. Most of the time they're not able to be collected. And although this family does include a lot of the more difficult corals to take care of in a glass aquarium, they are very rewarding in terms of growth. Generally, a lot of these corals are going to grow on the faster side, and they offer a lot of texture, a lot of color that you don't really see in other corals, which it just makes for a very nice appearance in a lot of aquariums. As always, let us know in the comments if you have any more questions, have any recommendations for future videos. Check us out at any 3 of our locations or on osachoice.com for all of your aquarium keeping needs, and keep on reefing.